For over 300 years the Vatican systematically mutilated thousands of young boys to create the perfect choir voices, and the last pope to keep these castrated children as his personal collection died less than 120 years ago. If you search for Alessandro Morschi 1902 recording after this video, you'll find the only castrato voice that still exists today. But as you listen to those haunting notes, remember this: you're hearing systematic child abuse sanctioned by the highest levels of the Catholic Church and hidden for centuries. This wasn't medieval barbarism. Pope Leo I was keeping castrated boys in his private Vatican chambers while the Wright brothers were learning to fly. These children, some as young as 8, were surgically mutilated before they could understand what was being done to them, their bodies permanently altered to preserve voices that the Church deemed more important than their humanity. The Vatican didn't just permit this horror, they created an entire institutional system to find, mutilate and control these boys. Papal policy: Vatican funding church protection for 3 centuries. The most powerful religious institution in the world treated children's bodies as raw materials for their musical ambitions. Today we're exposing how the Vatican built and maintained this system of abuse, why they kept it secret, and how some popes collected these mutilated boys like living trophies. Before diving into these forgotten stories of institutional betrayal, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Then comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared determination to uncover the truth that powerful institutions have tried so hard to bury. The story begins in 1585 when Pope Sixtus V signed a papal bull that would condemn thousands of children to lives of unimaginable suffering. With a stroke of his pen he officially authorized the use of castrated boys in the Sign Chapel choir, transforming what had been occasional practices into institutional policy. The Vatican's justification was simple: women were forbidden from singing in church services, and adult male voices were too deep for the ethereal music that God supposedly demanded. If nature wouldn't provide the perfect voice, the Church would create it through surgical mutilation. What followed was the birth of a system so methodical and widespread that it would make any modern human trafficking operation look amateur by comparison. The Vatican didn't just stumble into this practice, they engineered it with the same precision they applied to their theological doctrines and administrative structures. They created recruitment networks, established training protocols, and developed financial incentives that would ensure a steady supply of young boys for their musical ambitions. The hunting grounds were carefully chosen. Church representatives identified the poorest regions of Italy where families faced starvation and crushing debt. These weren't random selections, they were calculated targeting of the most vulnerable populations. The promise presented to desperate parents was seductive: your son could become rich and famous, serve God directly in the Vatican, and live in luxury beyond anything your family has ever known. All it required was a simple medical procedure. The reality, of course, was horrifically different. Parents weren't told that for every boy who survived the surgery and achieved success, dozens would die on makeshift operating tables or from infections in the weeks that followed. They weren't informed that even survivors would face lifelong medical complications, hormonal imbalances, and bone density problems that would plague them until their deaths. Most importantly, they weren't told that their children would be trapped in a system designed to exploit their vulnerability for the pleasure of powerful men. The selection process itself was dehumanizing beyond description. Vatican talent scouts working under direct orders from church hierarchy would travel through Italian provinces like livestock buyers at a market. They weren't looking for intelligence, character, or even necessarily exceptional musical ability in its natural form. They were seeking specific physical characteristics. Boys between 8 and 12 years old before puberty could naturally alter their voices with particular attention paid to throat structure, chest capacity, and overall physical appeal. These children were subjected to auditions that were really examinations, forced to sing for men who would decide whether their bodies were worth mutilating. The scouts took notes on each boy's appearance, voice quality, and family circumstances, creating detailed reports that read like inventory lists rather than assessments of human beings. Boys from certain Regions were particularly prized. Those from areas known for producing successful casti commanded higher prices and received more attention from Vatican recruiters. Once a boy was selected, the negotiation process began with the family. Church representatives were skilled manipulators trained to exploit parental desperation and religious devotion. They would arrive with stories of other boys who had achieved great success, carrying letters supposedly written by former castrati describing their wonderful lives in Rome. They presented the surgery as a divine calling, suggesting that God had chosen this particular child for special service. The financial offers, while seeming generous to impoverished families, were calculated to be just enough to overcome parental resistance without significantly impacting church resources. The surgery itself was performed without any of the medical knowledge or pain management we consider basic today. Boys were typically given alcohol or opium to dull the pain, then held down while barber surgeons or other practitioners performed the castration with primitive tools in unsanitary conditions. There was no anesthesia, no sterile environment, and no real understanding of infection control. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that roughly 80% of boys died either during the procedure or in the weeks immediately following from infection. Blood loss or shock for those who survived the recovery process was an extended nightmare of pain, confusion and uncertainty. These children, many of whom didn't fully understand what had been done to them, would spend months healing from their wounds while Vatican representatives waited to see if their voices would develop as hoped. Many boys' voices never achieved the desired quality, leaving them permanently disabled with no compensation or support from the church that had mutilated them. The Vatican's institutional support for this system was comprehensive and well-documented. The Sign Chapel represented the pinnacle of achievement for successful castrati, offering the most prestigious positions and highest salaries available to singers in the Catholic world. St. Peter's Basilica provided regular employment for those who didn't achieve the elite status of papal singers but still possessed adequate voices. The church invested enormous sums in housing, feeding, educating and maintaining their casti, treating them as valuable assets that required careful management. Housing arrangements were designed to maximize control while maintaining the illusion of privilege. Castrati lived within Vatican walls, isolated from the outside world, in quarters that were luxurious by the standards of their origins but were essentially elegant prisons. They had no freedom to leave, no ability to form relationships outside Vatican approval, and no contact with their families or communities. Every aspect of their daily lives was controlled by church authorities, from their diet and exercise regimens to their social interactions and even their religious practices. The educational investment provided to castrati was itself a form of control. While they received tutoring in literature, languages and cultural subjects that might seem like opportunities, these skills were taught primarily to make them more entertaining companions for their masters. They were expected to be able to discuss philosophy and politics, but only in ways that pleased their church superiors. Their education was another tool used to shape them into more perfect objects for Vatican enjoyment rather than preparation for independent lives. The economic engine driving this system was both vast and self-perpetuating. Vatican spending records show enormous investments in creating and maintaining castrati, with costs that would amount to millions of dollars in today's currency. But successful casti became valuable exports, performing across Europe and bringing prestige and donations back to the church. The more successful the system became, the more boys were mutilated to meet increasing demand from wealthy patrons who wanted their own musical angels. The supply and demand dynamics created a marketplace in human suffering that spanned the entire Catholic world. Wealthy families and nobles began copying Vatican practices, creating their own collections of castrati and driving up prices for the most talented singers. This increased demand provided financial incentives for expanding the recruitment networks, leading to more aggressive targeting of vulnerable families and higher quotas for church representatives tasked with finding suitable boys. What made this system particularly insidious was how it was presented as divine will rather than human choice. The Vatican wrapped the entire operation in religious rhetoric, claiming that these boys were chosen by God for special service and that their sacrifice was necessary for proper worship. This religious justification made it almost impossible for victims or their families to question the system without appearing to challenge God himself, creating a perfect shield against criticism or resistance the regional networks established to supply. This system reached into every corner of Catholic Europe, but Italy remained the primary source due to its proximity to Rome and the Vatican's direct influence over local authorities. Certain provinces became known as castrato factories, where families understood that selling their sons to the church was an expected part of economic survival. This normalization of child mutilation created communities where parents planned which sons they would sacrifice, treating it as a tragic but necessary business transaction, rather than the horror it actually was. While the Vatican's institutional system of creating castrati was horrific enough, what happened within the private chambers of individual popes reveals an even darker truth about how these mutilated children were treated as personal possessions by the most powerful men in the Catholic Church. These weren't just singers employed by the Vatican, they were living collections, kept as private entertainment for papal pleasure, isolated from the world and completely dependent on their masters' whims. Pope Leo XIII, who reigned from 1878 to 1903, provides perhaps the most thoroughly documented case of a pope maintaining what can only be described as a personal collection of castrated boys. Vatican records from his papacy reveal expenditures that were extraordinary even by the standards of papal luxury, enormous sums dedicated to what church accountants euphemistically labeled musical education and special pastoral care. But diplomatic correspondence from foreign ambassadors tells a different story, describing the Pope's unusual attachment to his young singers and raising questions about arrangements that seem to have little to do with religious worship. Leo XIII's castrati lived in specially designated quarters within the Vatican walls, completely cut off from the outside world. Unlike other church employees who might have some freedom of movement or contact with family, these boys were kept in what amounted to luxurious isolation. They had no schedules except those dictated by the Pope's desires, no relationships except those he permitted, and no purpose beyond providing him with private musical performances that often stretched late into the night. Contemporary accounts describe how the Pope would summon different boys at different times, sometimes keeping one or two in his private apartments for days at a time while the others waited in their quarters, never knowing when they might be called. The daily routines imposed on these children were designed to maintain their complete dependency on papal favor. They were awakened each morning not knowing whether they would spend the day in their rooms, be called for religious ceremonies, or be summoned to the Pope's private chambers. This uncertainty was itself a form of psychological control, keeping them in a constant state of anxiety and anticipation when they were called to perform. It wasn't for the grand ceremonies that might suggest legitimate religious purposes. These were intimate concerts for the Pope's personal enjoyment, often with no one else present except perhaps a trusted aide or secretary. The case of Alessandro Moreschi, whose voice we mentioned earlier, illustrates how completely these boys' lives were controlled by their papal masters. Born in 1858 and castrated around age 8, Moreschi was recruited directly by Vatican agents and brought to Rome as a child. His entire life was shaped by his service to successive popes, rising through the Vatican hierarchy to become the lead soprano of the Sign Chapel. But his position came with a terrible price: complete isolation from normal human relationships and total dependence on church approval for every aspect of his existence. Moreschi's living conditions within the Vatican were luxurious by any external measure. He had private quarters, personal servants, fine clothing, and access to the best medical care available, but luxury cannot mask imprisonment, and that's exactly what his situation was. He couldn't leave the Vatican without permission, couldn't form friendships outside approved circles, and couldn't even express preferences about his own daily schedule. Every comfort he enjoyed was a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment, creating a psychological dynamic where he had to constantly perform gratitude and compliance to maintain his relatively privileged position. The recordings Moreschi made in 1902 and 1904 provide haunting evidence of what this system produced. When you listen to those scratchy ancient recordings, you're hearing not just a unique vocal technique but the voice of a man whose entire existence had been shaped by institutional abuse. The trembling quality in his voice, which music Historians often attribute to emotion or age takes on a different meaning when you understand the psychological trauma that defined his life. He lived until 1922, spending his final years in the same Vatican quarters where he had been kept as a child, alone and forgotten as the world moved on from the practices that had created him. But perhaps the most disturbing documented case involves Pope Innocent XI and a young castrato named Giovanni during the late 17th century. Vatican records from Innocent XI's reign, which lasted from 1676 to 1689, show unusual expenditures related to the care of this particular boy, who was brought to the Vatican at age 10 and given unprecedented access to the Pope's private chambers. Contemporary accounts from Vatican servants describe how Giovanni lived not in the communal quarters used by other castrati but in rooms adjacent to the Pope's own apartments with direct access that bypassed normal Vatican protocols. The relationship between Innocent XI and Giovanni became the subject of whispered scandal among Roman nobility, who noted the Pope's obsessive attention to the child and the extraordinary privileges granted to him. Giovanni was dressed in clothes befitting a young prince, given jewelry and gifts that exceeded what was provided to adult church officials, and accompanied the Pope on private walks in Vatican gardens where no other attendants were permitted. Diplomatic correspondence from the period includes carefully worded observations from foreign ambassadors who were clearly uncomfortable with what they witnessed but couldn't directly criticize the Pope without creating international incidents. The mystery surrounding Giovanni's death at age 14 adds another layer of darkness to this story. Vatican medical records from the period are incomplete, but what documentation exists suggests he died suddenly and unexpectedly with no clear cause listed in church archives. More tellingly, immediately after Giovanni's death, Pope Innocent XI ordered the destruction of all personal correspondence related to the boy and had his rooms completely redecorated, as if trying to erase any evidence of what had transpired there. The Pope's own behavior changed dramatically after Giovanni's death. Servants noted that he became withdrawn and melancholic, refusing to meet with other castrati and showing little interest in musical performances that had previously consumed much of his time. Pope Alexander VII, who reigned for only 2 years from 1689 to 1691, demonstrated how quickly and efficiently the Vatican could organize these personal collections. Within months of his election, he had assembled a group of 6 casti boys, all between the ages of 10 and 14, who were housed together in a special wing of the Vatican and kept available for what church records describe as private ceremonial purposes. But diplomatic reports from the period tell a different story, describing exclusive religious services where only these boys were present, conducted in the Pope's private chapel with no other attendants or witnesses. The expense records from Alexander VI's brief papacy show spending on these boys that was extraordinary even by Vatican standards. They were provided with silk clothing, jewelry, special foods and personal tutors, but they were also subjected to isolation that was absolute. Foreign ambassadors noted the inappropriate arrangements and complained to their governments about audiences with the Pope where these boys were prominently displayed dressed in elaborate costumes that seemed designed to emphasize their youth and beauty rather than any religious function. What made these papal collections particularly insidious was how they were justified through religious rhetoric. The Vatican's official position was that these boys were serving God through their musical gifts and that their close proximity to the Pope allowed them to receive special spiritual guidance. This religious justification made it almost impossible for anyone to question what was happening without appearing to challenge the Pope's spiritual authority. Even foreign diplomats who were clearly uncomfortable with what they witnessed felt constrained in their criticism, knowing that accusations against the Pope could have serious political consequences for their country's relationships with the Catholic Church. The broader network supporting these papal collections extended far beyond the Vatican walls. Cardinal-level church officials maintained their own smaller groups of casti, creating a hierarchy of exploitation that mirrored the Church's administrative structure. Wealthy Catholic nobles copied these practices, establishing their own households with castrated boys and competing for the most talented or beautiful singers. This created a market that drove continued recruitment and mutilation as demand consistently exceeded supply. The psychological control techniques employed in managing these personal collections were sophisticated and devastating. Boys were deliberately isolated from each other to prevent the formation of supportive relationships that might provide emotional strength or encourage resistance. They were given special privileges and shown temporary kindness that could be withdrawn as punishment, creating constant anxiety about their status and behavior. Most insidiously, they were taught that their suffering was divinely ordained, and that their service to powerful men was a form of religious devotion. The training regimens imposed on these papal castrati went far beyond musical education. They were taught how to move gracefully, how to engage in sophisticated conversation, how to anticipate their master's moods and desires before being asked. This wasn't education in any meaningful sense, it was conditioning designed to create perfectly compliant companions who could provide entertainment, conversation, and whatever else their papal masters desired. The boys learned to read subtle cues about when to be present and when to make themselves invisible, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to appear grateful and content regardless of their true feelings. The seasonal rhythms of Vatican life created additional pressures for these personal collections. During major religious festivals, the boys might be displayed in elaborate ceremonies that showcased the Pope's wealth and refined tastes. During quieter periods, they faced the anxiety of not knowing when they might be summoned for private audiences that could last hours or days. The unpredictability was itself a form of control, ensuring that they remained constantly focused on pleasing their papal masters rather than developing any sense of independent identity or purpose. As the world began to change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, bringing new ideas about human rights and child protection, the Vatican faced a growing problem: the systematic mutilation of children that had served their musical ambitions for over 3 centuries was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to a world that was slowly recognizing the fundamental dignity of all human beings. But rather than acknowledging the horror of what they had done, church leadership chose a different path: a carefully orchestrated campaign to erase, minimize, and rewrite the history of their involvement in systematic child abuse. Pope Leo XIII, the same man who had maintained his personal collection of castrated boys well into the 20th century, began what would become a decades-long process of gradually distancing the Vatican from these practices while protecting the institution's reputation. Starting in the 1880s, Vatican policy shifted from actively recruiting new castrati to simply maintaining those already in service. This wasn't motivated by moral awakening or concern for children's welfare. It was a calculated response to changing public opinion and the growing risk that continued practices might expose the Church to criticism or legal challenges. The gradual phase-out was designed to avoid any sudden changes that might draw attention to what had been happening for centuries. New castrations were quietly discouraged, then restricted, and finally banned altogether in 1902. But existing castrati continued to serve in Vatican choirs until Aleandro Moris's retirement in 1913. This slow transition allowed the Church to claim they were simply following changing cultural norms rather than abandoning practices they had always known were wrong. But even as they were ending the creation of new castrati, Vatican officials were already working to control how this history would be remembered. The systematic destruction of evidence began while Moreschi was still singing in the Sign Chapel. Church archivists received orders to remove or destroy documents related to castrati recruitment, the financial arrangements with families, the medical procedures, and especially any records detailing the personal relationships between church officials and their castrated singers. The purges of Vatican's secret archives were thorough and deliberate employment. Contracts that detailed how boys were acquired disappeared. Payment records showing Vatican funding for surgical procedures vanished. Most importantly, personal correspondence between popes and their favored castrati was systematically destroyed, along with any documents that might reveal the true nature of these relationships. What remains in Vatican archives today represents only a fraction of what once existed, carefully curated to minimize church culpability and obscure the most damaging evidence. Witness intimidation was another crucial component of the cover-up. Surviving castrati were strongly encouraged to remain silent about their experiences with Vatican officials, making it clear that speaking publicly about their treatment could result in loss of church support and financial assistance for men who had been completely dependent on the church since childhood and who possessed no skills or connections outside Vatican walls. This threat was devastating. Most chose silence over the risk of destitution. The few castrati who attempted to share their stories found themselves facing more than just loss of church support. Vatican influence extended into academic and publishing circles, where church officials worked to prevent the publication of memoirs or scholarly works that might cast the institution in a negative light. Publishers who specialized in religious or historical texts were particularly susceptible to church pressure, as their businesses depended on maintaining good relationships with Catholic institutions. The religious justification system that had enabled these practices for centuries now became a tool for historical revisionism. Church scholars began promoting a sanitized version of castrati history that emphasized their artistic achievements while minimizing the systematic abuse that created them. The boys who had been mutilated against their will were recast as willing servants who had made noble sacrifices for the glory of God and the beauty of sacred music. The popes who had kept them as personal collections were presented as patrons of the arts rather than predators who had exploited vulnerable children. Biblical interpretation was weaponized to support this revised narrative. Church officials pointed to Matthew 1:1, 19:12, where Jesus speaks of those who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, claiming this provided divine authorization for castration in service of religious purposes. This interpretation conveniently ignored the fact that the boys subjected to these procedures were children who could not consent to making themselves anything, and that their mutilation served the personal pleasure of church officials rather than any legitimate religious purpose. The human cost of this cover-up extended far beyond simple historical revision. Surviving casti found themselves trapped in a world that no longer acknowledged their suffering or provided support for the unique challenges they faced. Aleandro Morski spent his final years in increasing isolation and depression. Cut off from the world he had never been allowed to enter and abandoned by the institution that had shaped his entire existence, he died in 1922 alone and largely forgotten, his voice preserved only in those haunting recordings that serve as the sole remaining testament to the thousands of boys whose lives were destroyed by Vatican ambitions. The psychological damage inflicted on these men lasted their entire lives. They struggled with identity issues that went far beyond the physical effects of their mutilation. In a society that defined manhood through traditional gender roles and sexual relationships, castrati existed in a liminal space where they belonged nowhere and were accepted by no one. Many suffered from severe depression and anxiety, with several documented cases of suicide among men who simply couldn't bear the isolation and alienation that defined their existence. The economic abandonment was equally cruel as public interest in castrati voices declined, and the Vatican distanced itself from these singers. Men who had devoted their entire lives to church service found themselves without support or resources. They possessed no marketable skills outside of musical performance, had no family connections or social networks beyond the church, and faced a world that increasingly viewed them as historical curiosities rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. Modern historical reckoning with this legacy has been slow and incomplete. While scholars today recognize the casti system as systematic institutional child abuse, the Vatican has never formally apologized for its role in creating and maintaining these practices. Official church statements acknowledged that historical approaches to many issues were flawed, but they stopped short of taking direct responsibility for the systematic mutilation of children or providing any form of compensation to victims' families or communities. The continued restrictions on access to Vatican archives ensure that many details of this historical atrocity remain hidden. Researchers studying this period face significant obstacles in accessing documents that might shed additional light on church involvement with Vatican officials, maintaining that many relevant records were lost or are too sensitive for public review. This ongoing secrecy perpetuates the cover-up that began over a century ago and prevents full accountability for these Historical crimes. The parallels to modern institutional abuse scandals are impossible to ignore. The same patterns of systematic exploitation, institutional protection of perpetrators, and aggressive cover-up campaigns that characterize the castrated system can be seen in contemporary cases of church abuse. The Vatican's handling of this historical atrocity provides a blueprint for understanding how powerful institutions can maintain public respectability while enabling horrific practices behind closed doors. The silence surrounding these stories for so long reflects our continued discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of institutional power and its capacity for systematic abuse. By examining what happened to the caste of the Vatican, we gain insight into how religious authority can be weaponized to normalize practices that any reasonable person would recognize as torture and exploitation. Their experiences serve as a warning about what can happen when societies allow powerful institutions to operate without transparency or accountability, treating vulnerable populations as expendable resources for institutional goals. As we reflect on these forgotten stories of systematic institutional abuse, we must remember that behind every historical statistic was a real child with hopes, dreams, and a future that was stolen before they could understand what was being taken from them. The castrati of the Vatican were not footnotes to musical history but human beings whose experiences reveal devastating truths about power, exploitation, and how easily societies can normalize the unthinkable when it serves the interests of those in control. Their stories challenge us to look beyond the marble statues and golden treasures of religious institutions to see the human cost that powerful organizations have always been willing to pay for their ambitions. They remind us that historical progress and cultural achievement often came at the expense of the most vulnerable members of society, and that the price of institutional glory was frequently paid by those who had no choice and no voice in the matter. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates how institutions can maintain elaborate moral and legal systems while simultaneously operating networks of abuse that would horrify any reasonable person. The Vatican's ability to present itself as a moral authority while systematically mutilating children for centuries shows how selective institutional reasoning becomes when it challenges existing power structures and financial interests. These young men's experiences also illuminate the incredible resilience of the human spirit despite facing circumstances designed to break them completely. Many found ways to maintain some sense of self and dignity. Their small acts of resistance, moments of connection with others, and determination to survive represent triumphs of humanity over systematic dehumanization that deserve to be remembered and honored. Understanding their stories helps us recognize similar patterns of exploitation and abuse in our own time. While the specific forms may have changed, the underlying dynamics of institutional power, vulnerability, and systematic oppression remain tragically relevant today. Their experiences serve as a warning about what happens when societies allow powerful institutions to treat human beings as objects for their pleasure and profit, operating behind closed doors. Without transparency or accountability, the silence that has surrounded these stories for so long reflects our continued discomfort with acknowledging the full extent of historical injustice and institutional complicity in systematic abuse. By bringing these forgotten voices back into historical consciousness, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of our obligation to prevent such systematic dehumanization from occurring again. The castrati of the Vatican lived and died in circumstances that no human being should ever have to endure. Their stories deserve to be remembered not as disturbing historical curiosities but as testimonies to human suffering and resilience that challenge us to build a world where such exploitation becomes impossible. Their legacy forces us to examine our own society's treatment of its most vulnerable members and to ask ourselves what future historians might discover about the systematic injustices we choose to ignore or accept today. The truth about institutional power isn't found in marble statues and golden altars. It's